In medieval Europe, becoming a royal bride was far from a fairy tale. Behind the glittering gowns, lavish ceremonies, and grand titles lay a world of relentless expectation, scrutiny, and control. Young women were thrust into roles that demanded perfection in appearance, behavior, and obedience, often before they could fully comprehend what was happening. Every gesture, every smile, and every decision was watched, recorded, and judged by family, courtiers, and advisors, with political stakes that could shape kingdoms. From secret rituals to strict household rules, the lives of these brides were dictated by tradition, superstition, and power. In this world, what seems shocking today was ordinary then, and survival required navigating danger, duty, and deception at every turn. Step inside a reality where marriage was both spectacle and trap. Born to marry a crown. From the moment they were born, royal daughters entered a world where every heartbeat and gesture was accounted for, measured, and often evaluated as a future asset to the crown. A princess in 14th century Europe did not grow up with the freedom to explore or play without guidance. Her nursery was simultaneously a training ground and an observation post. Cradles in French and English castles were placed near the eyes of attendants and wet nurses, not merely to monitor health, but to ensure posture and demeanor conformed to what would later be expected at court. In 1361, documents from the English royal household describe the young Princess Margaret of England being instructed in the correct way to hold her head while sucking from a cup, demonstrating that even the most mundane childhood acts were scrutinized for potential social significance. Tutors arrived early, often before the child could walk, bringing with them rigorous lessons in etiquette, proper speech, and comportment that were considered essential for a successful dynastic marriage. By the age of 7, girls were expected to navigate complex courtly protocols, understand titles and ranks, and memorize appropriate responses to questions from visiting dignitaries. Records from the Burgundian court in the late 15th century indicate that young brides in training were observed performing curtsies and bows for hours, with any deviation corrected immediately. Mistakes were noted in household logs, as even minor failures were interpreted as potential indicators of future incapacity to manage a court. Education was focused not on intellectual curiosity, but on practicality for political service. Princesses studied foreign languages, usually French or Latin, to communicate with potential allies and in-laws, while also learning arithmetic enough to manage a dowry or estates. They were trained to sew, embroider, and maintain a wardrobe suitable for display, as appearance in public was closely tied to prestige. Chronicles from the late 13th century in Castile describe the daughters of King Sancho IV practicing elaborate embroidery for hours each day under the supervision of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, both for skill and for demonstration of obedience and patience. The environment of the castle reinforced a sense of obligation over personal desire. Parents and guardians measured the success of their daughters not by happiness or personal achievement, but by composure and adaptability in front of visitors. Accounts of the court of Charles IV of France note that even children as young as 5 were assessed on their ability to sit quietly during banquets, react appropriately to strangers, and maintain a serene expression during formal introductions. Diaries of attendants describe children who were scolded for giggling or showing fear, illustrating that emotional restraint was considered more valuable than comfort or enjoyment. In addition to social preparation, physical appearance was heavily controlled. Diets were regulated to ensure proper growth and a slim, youthful appearance that would later appeal to potential husbands. Medical records from the Bavarian court around 1380 to 1390 show that young girls were given specific herbal concoctions and bathing routines designed to maintain clear skin and maintain posture, reflecting an early obsession with controlling the body for political optics. Hair and nails were monitored, and minor deformities or irregularities were noted as concerns for future marriageability. Even in moments that might appear to be private or playful, royal daughters were conditioned to think of themselves as extensions of dynastic ambition. Letters from the court of Margaret of Anjou, written in 1445, reveal that her behavior at age 6 during formal audiences was scrutinized by both mother and tutors, with repeated corrections issued for the smallest lapses. In these households, playtime was often disguised as lessons in socialization, and childhood friendships were regulated to avoid improper influence. By the time these girls were on the cusp of adolescence, the distinction between personal identity and political tool had largely disappeared. Their entire lives had been oriented toward a single purpose: to become the perfect candidate for marriage that would secure alliances, produce heirs, and reflect the prestige of their family. Every movement, word, and glance was part of ongoing preparation for a future that had been predetermined the moment they were born, leaving little room for autonomy, leisure, or personal preference. Marriage negotiations or human auctions. Royal marriages in medieval Europe were rarely matters of affection. They were meticulously orchestrated political maneuvers with daughters as central instruments of negotiation. Fathers, uncles, and advisors treated girls as assets, their value assessed in dowries, land, and dynastic advantage. The records of King Edward I of England, spanning the 1270s to the 1290s, reveal negotiations for his daughters spanning months, with ambassadors measuring gold, jewels, and even livestock offered as part of the arrangement. Daughters were often presented in person, not for choice, but to assure prospective in-laws of health, appearance, and comportment. Their smiles, posture, and responsiveness became bargaining tools in what can be described as human auctions conducted across courts and cathedrals. Negotiations were formal, complex, and frequently public, with scribes recording every promise, clause, and stipulation. A typical contract might stipulate that the bride produce a certain number of heirs, maintain a specific level of personal comportment, or refrain from acting independently in estate management. In 1383, the Treaty of Three Sisters in Aragon, Castile, and Portugal included clauses detailing which lands a young princess could control, stipulating that failure to produce heirs could trigger territorial reassignment. Chroniclers noted that these discussions often ignored the bride's comfort or opinion entirely, focusing instead on the political ramifications of her marriage. Dowries were central to negotiations, and their scale reflected both the family's wealth and the importance of the alliance. The marriage of Isabella of France to Edward II of England in 1308 is one of the best documented examples, with her dowry totaling £10,000 sterling, a fortune in the era, accompanied by gifts of jewelry, tapestries, and livestock. Negotiators ensured that every item, from silver spoons to entire estates, was listed with precision. Families went to extreme lengths to assemble such resources, borrowing from banks in Florence or liquidating portions of their holdings. Failure to meet the agreed amount could invalidate an engagement and bring shame or financial ruin to the family. Potential fertility and lineage were also scrutinized as part of these negotiations. Physicians were often consulted to assess the health and reproductive viability of prospective brides, with reports delivered to negotiating parties. The chronicler Jean Froissart records that in 1385, a physician examined a 12-year-old French princess intended for marriage to a Burgundian duke, providing a detailed account of her physical maturity and projected fertility, demonstrating the degree to which medical scrutiny intersected with politics. Girls were sometimes required to undergo repeated examinations over months to satisfy the groom's family, leaving them aware that their bodies were under constant evaluation. Beyond financial and health considerations, contracts often contained restrictions on personal freedom. A bride might be prohibited from traveling without her husband's consent, required to reside in his court indefinitely, or obligated to defer to his advisors in estate management. The marriage of Margaret of Anjou, contracted in 1445 to Henry VI of England, included clauses that she would follow the king wherever his reign required, despite her being barely 15 at the time. Legal instruments were drafted with meticulous attention to detail, sometimes including penalties for perceived insubordination, effectively erasing the bride's autonomy before she even entered her husband's household. Ambassadors and family representatives orchestrated meetings with precision, often assessing a bride through extended observation of her behavior during public appearances. Chronicles from the court of Burgundy describe young girls presented at banquets and religious services, their manners and speech carefully recorded. A minor mistake, such as a faltering curtsy or hesitation in conversation, could be reported back to the groom's family and influence negotiations, reinforcing the idea that the girl's value was entirely transactional. Even ceremonies associated with betrothal were heavily negotiated, gifts exchanged, glances noted, and ceremonial gestures like stepping on coins or presenting symbolic items were scrutinized as indicators of sincerity, obedience, and grace. In 1371, a French princess, presented to the Count of Savoy, was required to exchange gloves and perform formal bows multiple times in succession before the ceremony could be considered complete, illustrating how political theater dominated what was superficially a personal union. From cradle to contract, the lives of royal daughters were structured to maximize their perceived worth. Each negotiation, each contract, and each ceremonial gesture reinforced the notion that they were instruments of statecraft, their individuality subordinated to dynastic ambition. Families, courts, and political advisors monitored their every move, transforming childhood and adolescence into a period of rigorous preparation for transactions that would determine the political landscape of entire kingdoms, leaving little room for personal preference or autonomy. Betrothal rituals that terrify modern eyes. Betrothal ceremonies in medieval Europe were rarely private affairs, and for young royal brides, they could be both terrifying and bewildering. The events were designed as much to impress political allies as to formalize a marriage, turning children into public symbols of diplomacy. In 1366, Joanna of Navarre, aged just 11, was betrothed to the future Henry IV of England, and her presentation involved a procession through the castle halls before assembled nobles and ambassadors. She was instructed to maintain perfect posture, smile appropriately, and bow at precise intervals, her every gesture scrutinized by observers who recorded even minor errors in official chronicles. Many ceremonies incorporated symbolic acts that modern audiences might find disturbing. Exchanging gloves, for example, was not simply a gesture of politeness. It signified trust, loyalty, and the binding of two families. Records from 1298 describe a betrothal between a French princess and the Duke of Burgundy, in which the young bride was required to place her gloved hand into the groom's multiple times over the course of the day, each exchange carefully supervised by courtiers to ensure decorum. Mistakes were often noted in official accounts as failures to uphold familial dignity, emphasizing that the child's composure had tangible political consequences. Other rituals involved shared consumption, sometimes with peculiar and anxiety-inducing elements. Stepping on coins together, tasting bread, or drinking from the same cup were acts intended to symbolize unity and shared fortune. The marriage contract of Blanche of Castile in 1180 included a betrothal feast where the bride and groom were instructed to taste the same loaf of bread in front of assembled witnesses, a practice recorded by chroniclers as both solemn and stressful for the young girl. Diaries of attendants reveal that girls often trembled, unsure how to navigate these expectations while remaining dignified. The sheer visibility of these events amplified their psychological impact. Crowds of courtiers, ambassadors, and family members observed every reaction, leaving no room for error or hesitation. In 1402, the betrothal of Margaret of Bavaria to John, Duke of Cleves, involved a ceremony in which she was presented in a hall filled with over 100 guests, all of whom were expected to evaluate her behavior. Chroniclers noted that her hands shook during the ritual, and whispers about her composure circulated among attendants, demonstrating the social pressure placed on children to perform flawlessly. Attendants and advisors played both practical and coercive roles. They coached the girls in gestures, expressions, and speech, often enforcing strict protocols through intimidation or constant reminders. Some betrothal guides surviving from the 14th century suggest instructions like, "Maintain your gaze on the groom, do not fidget, for every motion reflects your family's honor," revealing the meticulous monitoring imposed on these young brides. Mistakes were not private. They could be noted in reports, letters, or even official chronicles, potentially affecting political alliances or dowry negotiations. Fear of public embarrassment was compounded by the legal implications of betrothal. These ceremonies were binding contracts in themselves, not merely symbolic gestures. Breaking an engagement could provoke lawsuits, fines, or diplomatic tension. In 1325, Isabella of France was betrothed to Edward II of England, and any deviation from prescribed ceremonial behavior could have jeopardized her position and the alliance itself. Historians note that these public rituals functioned both as legal formalities and instruments of social control, ensuring compliance through anxiety and spectacle. Young brides were also subjected to rituals that modern observers would consider invasive. Public displays of obedience, demonstrations of modesty, and enforced interactions with future in-laws were all part of a calculated effort to evaluate temperament and suitability. The chronicler Jean de Wauvrin recorded in 1471 that a bride at the Burgundian court was made to kneel and recite oaths in the presence of senior nobles, with her posture and tone analyzed as a measure of character and grace. These rituals, while framed as honorific, often left girls trembling, anxious, and acutely aware that every minor infraction could have lasting consequences. Betrothal ceremonies combined politics, law, and social spectacle, producing an environment in which a young girl's entire future hinged on her ability to perform perfectly. Across Europe, from France to England to the courts of Burgundy, the records consistently show that these events were less about celebration and more about control, observation, and the negotiation of dynastic power. Fear, performance anxiety, and constant monitoring defined the experience, leaving royal brides to navigate a complex web of expectation, ritual, and obligation long before their wedding day. Dowries and their deadly expectations. In medieval Europe, a royal bride's value was often measured not by her character or intelligence, but by the size and contents of her dowry. Dowries were far more than gifts. They were complex bundles of wealth, property, and political leverage. Historical records from 1347 indicate that when Eleanor of Provence was married to King Henry III of England, her dowry included lands in Provence, a collection of jewels valued at over £15,000, and several thousand head of livestock, all meticulously catalogued by scribes. Every coin, cow, and parcel of land was scrutinized by financial officers, creating pressure not only on the bride's family, but on the girl herself, who was aware that her family's honor rested on her marriage transaction. Failure to meet dowry expectations could have catastrophic consequences. In 1204, the planned marriage between Joan of England and King Alexander II of Scotland nearly collapsed because her family had delayed sending part of her dowry, prompting months of diplomatic negotiations and financial arrangements. Letters from Henry II of England revealed tense correspondence with Scottish officials, emphasizing that a shortfall could imperil alliances, provoke humiliation, and even spark territorial disputes. For the young bride, these arrangements were more than stressful. They framed her life as a commodity in ongoing political chess games. Dowries were also used to enforce obedience and secure political loyalty. In 1350, the marriage contract of Margaret of France to King Edward I of England stipulated that failure to produce heirs or maintain political allegiance could result in forfeiture of part of her dowry. These clauses made clear that her financial contribution was not merely symbolic. It was a tool to control her actions and reinforce the power of her husband's family. The bride herself had little agency, with records showing that families could even be compelled to sell lands or liquidate assets to meet contractual obligations, effectively mortgaging their future to satisfy immediate political needs. The contents of dowries were diverse and often included items that would seem strange or excessive today. Jewelry, tapestries, and fine fabrics were standard, but some families added more practical resources such as horses, grain, or even entire villages. Chroniclers from 1295 describe the dowry of Beatrice of Sicily, which included 5 castles, multiple vineyards, and a detailed inventory of livestock, including oxen, sheep, and goats. Such contributions were meant to demonstrate wealth, stability, and capacity to support a future royal household. Yet they imposed enormous logistical burdens. Families recorded each asset with precision, noting condition, quantity, and transfer protocols, highlighting the transactional nature of marriage over the personal agency of the bride. The financial pressure sometimes led to extreme measures. In 1382, the family of Anne of Bohemia reportedly borrowed heavily and sold lands to meet the terms of her marriage to King Richard II of England. Chroniclers note that her father's lands were mortgaged to cover the cost of jewels and ceremonial expenses, leaving the family vulnerable to economic strain for decades. The bride, only 13 at the time, was aware of the sacrifices her family made on her behalf, creating a sense of obligation and anxiety that colored her early years in the English court. Beyond finance, dowries reinforce social hierarchy and control over female bodies. Historical documents reveal that dowries often included specific requirements for the bride's behavior, wardrobe, and household management skills. Failure to meet these expectations could trigger disputes or even annulments. In 1420, the marriage contract of Catherine of Valois included provisions specifying that she must maintain the household according to precise protocols and provide heirs within a defined time frame. This meant that her value was continually assessed, both before and after marriage, linking her worth directly to her capacity to fulfill duties dictated by her dowry's terms. Dowries were legal, economic, and political instruments, shaping the lives of royal brides from birth. They determined where a girl would live, whom she would marry, and what resources she could command. Far from a celebratory gift, a dowry represented a life of obligations, scrutiny, and constant pressure, with consequences that extended across borders and generations. For the young brides, it was an early introduction to the harsh reality that their bodies, fortunes, and futures were intrinsically tied to political strategy rather than personal choice. The shadow of age and consent. In medieval Europe, age was rarely a barrier to marriage, and the concept of consent was practically non-existent for royal brides. Girls were often betrothed or married well before they reached puberty, with political expedience overriding personal readiness or emotional maturity. Records from 1274 show that Margaret of England, daughter of King Edward I, was betrothed at 7 to John II of Brabant, though the marriage would not be consummated until years later. Such arrangements were entirely driven by diplomacy, alliances, and dynastic strategy, leaving the child with little agency or understanding of the life being imposed upon her. The disparity between the ages of bride and groom could be extreme. Chroniclers document instances where teenage girls were wed to men old enough to be their grandfathers. In 1308, Isabella of France, barely 12 years old, married Edward II of England, who was 20 to 25 years her senior. These unions were justified by claims of political stability, dynastic continuity, and divine sanction, framing what would now be considered coercion as both necessary and morally acceptable. Families and advisors stressed obedience, ensuring that the young bride understood that refusal was neither expected nor tolerated. Consent, as modern society defines it, was effectively irrelevant. Marriage contracts often included provisions specifying that the bride must submit to her husband's authority, produce heirs, and maintain household duties. Historical accounts from the court of France in the 14th century indicate that even private feelings or personal health were secondary to these obligations. Chroniclers note that brides were expected to travel long distances to join their husband's household, frequently in harsh conditions, with the expectation that reluctance or complaint would be met with social censure or direct pressure from family and attendants. The psychological toll on young brides was significant. Diaries and letters, though rare, reveal confusion, anxiety, and fear in girls forced into marriage. One account from 1299 details the journey of a 10-year-old bride, Eleanor of Castile, traveling to England under the supervision of an entourage of chaperones and guards. She reportedly wept throughout the voyage, yet her distress was framed as inconsequential in comparison to the political advantages her marriage would bring. Household staff and tutors were tasked with enforcing composure, instructing the girl to suppress emotion and perform decorum for the sake of diplomacy. The expectation to produce heirs added an additional layer of pressure, even before the marriage was consummated. Chroniclers indicate that young brides were educated in the principles of fertility and instructed by midwives and older female attendants on the bodily preparations required for future childbearing. In some courts, manuals were created detailing optimal diet, hygiene, and comportment to ensure reproductive success. These instructions could be intrusive, deeply personal, and imposed at ages that would make any modern observer question the ethics of such interventions. Legal frameworks reinforced these imbalances. Canon law permitted marriage for girls as young as 12, while boys could be married from 14, effectively codifying the asymmetry of power. Royal families and advisors invoked these statutes to legitimize unions that would have otherwise been morally or socially unacceptable. Marriage was framed not as a personal choice, but as a contractual, almost inevitable duty to the crown, the family, and the state. Even in cases where young brides resisted or displayed fear, their protests were often dismissed. Correspondence from 1315 describes a betrothed bride who attempted to delay her wedding, only to be pressured by her father and the king's council to comply immediately. Refusal could result in estrangement, loss of favor, or public scandal, making compliance the only viable option. These pressures ensured that royal brides internalized obedience as an essential component of survival, social standing, and family honor. The shadow of age and consent defined the earliest stages of a royal bride's life, setting a precedent for years of expectations, obligations, and scrutiny. From the moment negotiations were finalized to the first night in a foreign household, these young girls were subjected to political realities that left little room for choice, agency, or autonomy. Their youth, instead of being a period of freedom and growth, was transformed into preparation, discipline, and submission, illustrating the stark imbalance at the core of medieval dynastic marriage. Lessons in the art of seduction. For royal brides in medieval Europe, instruction in sexuality was as structured and obligatory as lessons in etiquette or courtly manners. These were not casual conversations, but formalized training sessions, often led by older women who had themselves navigated the intricate demands of marriage and reproduction. Historical records from 14th century France indicate that girls as young as 12 were taught by attendants, governesses, or even widowed noblewomen, sometimes referred to as matrons, about the expectations of physical intimacy, marital obedience, and the preservation of their husband's favor. The instruction was detailed, pragmatic, and, by modern standards, unsettling. Texts from the period illustrate that royal brides were expected to master the art of attracting and pleasing their husbands. Manuals advise them on posture during conversation, the subtleties of eye contact, and even the optimal ways to laugh or nod. Some documents explicitly instructed brides on physical gestures intended to demonstrate modesty and allure simultaneously. In a court handbook from 1320 at the French royal palace in Paris, one passage recommends that a young bride learn how to tilt her head at a precise angle while speaking, supposedly to accentuate femininity and encourage attention without overt display. The subject of fertility dominated these lessons. Midwives and matrons would explain how diet, activity, and even sleep could affect the likelihood of conception. Some of the instructions bordered on the superstitious. For example, it was advised that brides avoid sleeping with their feet uncovered or touching iron objects, both believed to inhibit fertility. Historical correspondence between English royal households from 1355 to 1360 reveals that young brides were closely monitored for signs of sexual maturity, with private reports sent to fathers and guardians detailing the girls' readiness to fulfill their reproductive obligations. Beyond fertility, brides were instructed in behaviors designed to maintain affection and political stability. They were taught to show attentiveness to their husband's desires, cultivate shared interests, and manage conflicts discreetly. One surviving letter from the Burgundian court in 1382 describes a royal tutor advising a 13-year-old bride to remain silent during arguments and use subtle gestures, like touching the groom's arm lightly, to demonstrate empathy and loyalty. The goal was to maintain harmony in a household that was not only personal, but profoundly political. The instruction was sometimes explicit. Some educational texts provided diagrams and practical guidance on the marital bed, particularly for older adolescents approaching consummation. These materials, preserved in fragmentary form in the libraries of monasteries or noble estates, reveal step-by-step advice, including proper positioning, attention to hygiene, and ways to respond to discomfort or fear. While the tone often framed these practices as necessary for dynastic continuity, the impact on young girls could be deeply distressing, as diaries and chroniclers occasionally note bouts of anxiety, tears, or reluctance among trainees. Cultural expectations reinforced these lessons. Royal brides were constantly reminded that their ability to please their husbands reflected on their family's honor, the stability of alliances, and even the security of the realm. For instance, Italian court records from 1370 indicate that a delay in consummating a marriage was considered a potential political threat, prompting counselors to intervene directly in private instruction. Royal girls were not merely expected to survive these sessions, they were expected to perform flawlessly, mastering skills that would secure both affection and legitimacy. The training extended beyond direct sexual behavior. Brides were educated in charm, conversation, and even the use of subtle flattery. In practice, this meant memorizing anecdotes, poems, or religious passages to recite at appropriate moments, demonstrating both intelligence and refinement. A manuscript from the court of Charles V of France includes instructions for a young bride on how to balance wit and humility during evening gatherings, ensuring the groom perceived both virtue and sophistication. Ultimately, lessons in the art of seduction were a calculated mix of pedagogy, coercion, and political strategy. The training emphasized the young bride's duty to her husband, her family, and the realm, prioritizing dynastic and social goals over personal comfort or autonomy. By the time she reached the age of marriage, her body, behavior, and mind had been conditioned to fulfill a singular politically charged role, leaving little space for choice or dissent. Preparing for the wedding night. Few moments in the life of a medieval royal bride carried the weight of expectation like the wedding night. It was not merely a personal milestone, but a public and dynastic event, heavily ritualized and fraught with anxiety. Preparations began long before the evening itself, often hours in advance, involving attendants, matrons, and physicians who ensured that everything from the bride's attire to her physical condition conformed to both social and symbolic requirements. Records from the English court of Edward III, dated 1361, show that a 13-year-old bride could spend nearly an entire day being bathed, perfumed, and dressed by a team of 10 attendants, each with a specific role in the ceremonial preparations. Bathing alone was a complex ritual. Heated water was drawn in large cauldrons, sometimes infused with herbs like rosemary or lavender, intended to cleanse, deodorize, and symbolically purify the bride. Chroniclers noted that the temperature had to be carefully monitored. Water too hot could burn, too cold would leave the bride shivering and vulnerable to illness. This bathing ceremony was rarely private, overseen by matrons whose instructions ranged from practical hygiene to admonitions about posture, gaze, and composure. Diaries from the Burgundian court record brides trembling not from cold alone, but from the pressure of constant observation. Once cleaned, the bride was adorned in her wedding gown, a garment often heavy, layered, and stiff, with embroidery, jewels, or gold thread. A gown in the French court of 1374 required at least 6 attendants to lace and fasten properly, while others adjusted trains and veils to ensure symmetry and alignment with superstition. Gowns were designed to impress, yes, but also to signal the bride's chastity, obedience, and wealth. Historical inventories show that ceremonial dresses often contained hidden symbols, such as small charms stitched into the lining to protect against evil spirits or to encourage fertility. Attendants would whisper the location of each charm, instructing the bride to touch or avoid certain areas as she moved, an added layer of ritual that could heighten nervousness. Superstition governed more than attire. Some brides were subject to public inspections to confirm virginity, an ordeal documented in records from 13th century Castile. These inspections were not always private and could involve matrons, physicians, or even members of the household staff, reflecting the political stakes tied to sexual purity. Other practices included the placement of protective talismans under the mattress, burning specific herbs to ensure marital harmony, or the recitation of prayers designed to ward off ill fortune. Manuscripts from the English royal household describe night preparations extending late into the evening, with attendants ensuring that no corner of the bridal chamber violated customary rituals. Diet and rest were also regulated. Brides were often given light meals or herbal infusions to promote calm, though some physicians prescribed specific concoctions to encourage fertility or prevent fainting, including wine diluted with honey or warm milk with cinnamon. Observers noted that young brides were sometimes administered these remedies under the supervision of attendants, who monitored reactions and adjusted dosages, a process that could be as intimidating as the ceremonial preparations themselves. Physical and mental readiness were equally emphasized. Courtiers and matrons drilled the bride on maintaining composure, proper gestures, and even vocal tones, believing that confidence and poise would influence the groom's behavior. Letters from the court of Charles V of France indicate that brides were encouraged to recite prayers or meditative chants to steady nerves, while some matrons provided instructional reassurance on expected marital interactions, blending guidance, ritual, and performance into a single overwhelming experience. Even as the evening approached, the bridal chamber became a stage of observation. Attendants remained close, correcting posture, whispering advice, and ensuring that symbolic protections were maintained. The bride's personal autonomy was minimal. Every decision, from seating to gesture, carried implication for family honor and dynastic legitimacy. Diaries from English and Burgundian households note the pervasive anxiety, recording shivers, hesitant movements, and moments of panic that were corrected, with both practical instruction and ceremonial reassurance. By the time the groom arrived, the young bride had undergone hours of physical preparation, psychological conditioning, and ritualized training, each designed to meet expectations that extended far beyond personal comfort. The wedding night was not private. It was a carefully orchestrated convergence of social, political, and dynastic priorities. Everything from attire to posture, from superstition to medicinal practices, was intended to ensure that the bride fulfilled the role she had been conditioned for since childhood, leaving her with little space to act on instinct or personal desire. Bridal chambers and medieval superstitions. The bridal chamber was the culmination of preparation, but it was far from a sanctuary. In medieval Europe, it was designed as both a private space and a stage for ritualized anxiety, heavily infused with superstition and symbolic meaning. Every object, placement, and colored choice carried weight, often dictated by advisors, matrons, or astrologers who claimed to influence the bride's fertility, fortune, and her husband's affection. Records from the court of Charles IV in Prague, dated 1372, show that a newlywed queen's chamber was meticulously arranged by 4 attendants and a court astrologer who oversaw the placement of candles, charms, and talismans meant to ensure marital success. Candles were central to the ritual. They were often arranged in geometric patterns believed to ward off evil spirits, attract luck, or guide fertility. The bride was instructed to avoid touching certain candles, while others were to be lit at precise times, sometimes accompanied by whispered invocations or prayers. Accounts from French castles in the late 14th century note that candle placement could take over an hour, and any misalignment required restarting the ritual entirely. This level of scrutiny reinforced the sense that the bride's fate rested on correct adherence to arcane instructions, intensifying fear and confusion. Herbs played an equally important role. Lavender, rue, rosemary, and other fragrant plants were hung in bundles, scattered beneath the bed, or tucked into pillows. They were intended to repel malevolent spirits, enhance fertility, or improve the bride's attractiveness. Chroniclers in Burgundy recorded that some brides spent the first night brushing herbs from their gowns to prevent illness, all while remaining mindful of precise placement dictated by superstition. Historical texts emphasize that certain herbs were to be touched only with the left hand, or in a clockwise motion, reflecting a blend of ritual, symbolism, and fear-driven obedience. Talismans were sometimes hidden beneath the mattress or sewn into bed linens. These objects ranged from small crosses and charms to elaborate embroidered symbols, representing fertility, protection, or marital fidelity. Inventories from English castles in 1389 describe a chamber containing 9 talismans beneath the mattress alone, each positioned according to an advisor's instruction. Some were personal gifts from family members, intended to safeguard the bride against misfortune, while others were supplied by court officials responsible for the spiritual and physical welfare of the household. The bed itself was a focal point of both superstition and practical control. Linen was often ritualistically folded and pressed, with prayers recited over the sheets, while specific patterns in mattress stuffing were believed to influence luck and reproductive success. Records from Castilian castles in the early 15th century describe attendants inserting small objects, like coins or embroidered sachets, between layers of straw, an act thought to bring prosperity to the couple. These measures could be intrusive, uncomfortable, and psychologically taxing, yet disobedience or error was rarely tolerated. Superstitions extended to the room's architecture and layout. Windows, mirrors, and doorways were sometimes activated with charms or strategic candle placement, a practice thought to prevent malevolent spirits from entering. In some cases, astrologers calculated auspicious positions for furniture based on the bride's birth date or the alignment of celestial bodies. A diary from a 1378 wedding in France notes that the bride spent 2 hours adjusting her bed and curtains under the astrologer's direction, a task that left her exhausted and anxious long before the groom's arrival. even minor lapses could carry social or symbolic consequences. Accounts show that a misplaced talisman or incorrectly lit candle could prompt reprimands from matrons, or, in extreme cases, cause fear that misfortune would follow. Young brides, already overwhelmed by ceremonial and physical preparation, were forced to navigate these rituals with precision, leaving little room for personal agency. By the time the groom entered the room, the bride had endured hours of instruction, adjustment, and symbolic preparation. She was surrounded by objects meant to protect, influence, or control her, while simultaneously under the watchful eyes of attendants and advisors. The bridal chamber was a place of anxiety as much as privacy, an environment where superstition, ritual, and expectation converged, and where the bride's compliance became a measure of her worth and readiness. The chamber's purpose extended far beyond comfort. It was a crucible of social, spiritual, and political pressure, designed to shape the bride for a role that demanded obedience, ritual performance, and enduring psychological strain. Groom preparations and their role in ceremony. While the bridal chamber brimmed with ritual and superstition, the groom's preparation was a different, though equally significant, kind of performance. Medieval grooms were expected to embody authority, strength, and competence, with emphasis on ceremonial knowledge, martial readiness, and the outward display of nobility, rather than the intense physical and symbolic scrutiny endured by brides. Records from the Duchy of Burgundy in 1385 indicate that a groom's preparation often began with hours spent on posture, attire, and the proper conduct for public appearances, all overseen by a master of ceremonies or senior court advisor. Clothing was of particular importance. The groom's garments were selected to convey power and status, and even minor errors could be interpreted as weakness or impropriety. Chronicles from the court of Edward III of England in 1361 describe a groom being reprimanded for improperly tying his doublet, a misstep that reportedly delayed the start of the wedding procession. Fabrics, colors, and accessories were not chosen for comfort but for visual impact. Gold embroidery, fur trims, and heavy cloaks emphasized wealth, lineage, and martial readiness. Jewelry, such as rings or chains, was worn strategically to signal alliances or inheritance, and even the choice of footwear could carry symbolic meaning regarding rank and propriety. Groomly instruction extended beyond clothing. Etiquette lessons were intense and exacting. Historical manuals from the late 14th century advised grooms on precise methods for greeting their bride, bowing to courtiers, and responding to ceremonial questions, all while maintaining an appearance of effortless confidence. Failure to master these protocols could be seen as a personal or familial embarrassment, with the potential to undermine political alliances. A record from the court of Charles V of France notes that grooms were sometimes required to rehearse processions repeatedly, practicing each step and gesture until it became second nature, illustrating the meticulous nature of ceremonial training. Martial preparation was also emphasized. Grooms were often seasoned warriors or trained in the art of combat, and their readiness was a public demonstration of protection and strength. Chronicles from the German principalities in 1397 reveal that grooms were expected to maintain weaponry, practice horsemanship, and demonstrate proficiency in swordplay, archery, or jousting prior to marriage ceremonies. These skills were showcased during processions, tournament-like displays, or in private audiences with the bride, reinforcing the perception that the groom was capable of defending both bride and realm. Religious preparation, while less ritualized than for brides, remained essential. Grooms were required to attend Mass, confess sins, and receive counsel from chaplains, though the focus was on demonstrating moral fitness and authority rather than purity or fertility. In some cases, chaplains advised on auspicious timings for marriage, fasting practices, or specific prayers, ensuring that the groom's spiritual readiness aligned with ceremonial expectations. Records from a 1374 wedding in the Kingdom of Castile note that the groom spent the morning performing a sequence of religious observances before donning his ceremonial garments, a process observed by several attendants to ensure compliance. Despite the rigors of preparation, historical accounts suggest that the contrast between brides and grooms was stark. Whereas the bride endured exhaustive rituals, symbolic tasks, and constant supervision, the groom's challenges were largely external: appearance, conduct, and martial skill. Diaries from English castles in the 1380s describe grooms reclining while attendants adjusted collars, polished boots, and rehearsed gestures. A far cry from the hours brides spent arranging candles, charms, and herbs. The imbalance underscores the gendered dynamics of medieval marriage. The bride's body and behavior were sites of scrutiny, control, and superstition, while the groom's role was measured in performance, strength, and authority. Grooms also benefited from dedicated personal attendants who managed clothing, weapons, and ceremonial instruction, reducing personal anxiety and leaving them freer to project confidence. One French court record from 1382 notes that a groom's valet spent 3 hours preparing the night for public presentation, while the bride simultaneously endured a 2-hour ritualized inspection of her virginity and talismans. Observers often commented that the disparity in preparation highlighted social priorities, emphasizing power and lineage over emotional or psychological well-being. By the time the ceremony commenced, the groom had been molded into a figure of authority, martial prowess, and ceremonial correctness, ready to embody the public face of marriage. Unlike brides, whose preparation was intensely private, symbolic, and psychological, the groom's role was largely performative, designed to display capability and dominance. The juxtaposition of these preparations reveals the medieval court's deep preoccupation with gender, power, and appearance, establishing a ritual framework that would govern the marriage from the first public display onward. Public spectacles of the wedding day. The wedding day in medieval Europe was never a private affair. It was a display of power, wealth, and politics, performed before townspeople, nobility, and visiting diplomats. Streets were lined with spectators, eager to witness the event, while musicians, trumpeters, and heralds created a constant soundtrack of ceremony. A chronicle from 1387 at the court of Richard II notes that over 20 people observed the bride before she even reached the cathedral, highlighting how public and intense these celebrations could be. Even small towns along the procession route prepared for days, hanging banners, cleaning streets, and arranging temporary seating to accommodate the curious and loyal alike. Brides were dressed to impress, their gowns heavy with silk, pearls, and gold embroidery. Veils marked virginity and family honor, and ceremonial trains sometimes exceeded 15 feet in length. Inventories from a 1369 Burgundian wedding list, 12 yards of silk, a jeweled girdle, and countless trinkets to display status. Grooms, in contrast, wore armor or ceremonial clothing, emphasizing martial skill and political authority. Every stitch, gem, and gesture was calculated to communicate the importance of the union. Some accounts note that attendants would spend hours adjusting robes and jewelry, while a misplaced jewel or crooked hem could spark whispers among guests about negligence or ill preparation. Processions were highly orchestrated. Heralds announced the union, reading the bride's ancestry and dowry aloud, sometimes for an hour, while minstrels and drummers provided rhythm for the parade. Observers noted every move. A bowed head, a hesitant step, or a misplaced gesture could be interpreted as disrespect or weakness. In one 1384 Castilian wedding, a misstep by the bride during the procession led to whispered doubts about her composure and the prudence of the marriage alliance. The bride herself had little agency, expected to maintain grace under relentless public scrutiny. Even minor errors could be exaggerated by chroniclers and passed down as cautionary tales for future brides. Feasts added another layer of spectacle. Bread, wine, and small gifts were distributed to demonstrate generosity. Jesters, acrobats, and musicians performed for the crowds, while attendants ensured the bride remained upright despite exhaustion from her heavy gown, heat, and nerves. Chronicles report young brides fainting from the strain, with attendants scolded for failing to support them. Beyond personal discomfort, public performance was politically consequential, with every gesture scrutinized by allies and rivals alike. The bride's ability to endure the day was often interpreted as an indicator of her future capability to manage courtly duties and domestic responsibilities. Seating arrangements were equally strategic. Nobles competed for proximity to the bride and groom, with prime positions signifying favor or influence. Disputes over seating occasionally escalated into physical confrontations. Even gifts carried meaning. Exotic spices, gold coins, or rare fabrics signaled wealth, loyalty, or political allegiance. Records from multiple 14th-century European courts carefully tracked gifts and seating, illustrating that even minor details were fraught with significance. Entertainment often continued through the day. Pageants, dances, and tournaments were staged to impress spectators and demonstrate martial skill or courtly refinement. Some performances included allegorical elements reflecting political power, loyalty, or virtue. A 1,391 Burgundian record details knights enacting a mythical conquest during a wedding. Interpreted as a metaphor for the combined authority of bride and groom, every aspect of the day reinforced the political purpose of the marriage, rather than the personal celebration of the couple. By the evening, the bride and groom had endured hours of observation, scrutiny, and performance. Exhaustion was common, especially for young brides, and mistakes could carry diplomatic consequences. Chroniclers frequently note that weddings were as much about reinforcing dynastic strength and hierarchy as they were about celebrating love or union. For brides, in particular, the day underscored the imbalance of power, where public display, obedience, and grace outweighed personal comfort or agency. The spectacle of a medieval wedding was relentless, immersive, and politically charged, leaving no room for privacy or error. By sunrise, the couple had already performed for hundreds, and the expectations for decorum, appearance, and symbolic action would continue long after the festivities concluded. The bride's role was central, but entirely prescribed, a living emblem of family honor, alliance, and dynastic strategy, her every gesture a measured display of political power as much as personal presence. Marriage contracts and lifelong obligations. The legal side of marriage in medieval Europe was far from simple. It was a structured and often terrifying instrument of control. Marriage contracts were meticulously drafted documents, outlining property rights, inheritance, behavioral expectations, and sometimes punishments for perceived disobedience. These contracts were as much about politics as family life, establishing alliances and securing wealth for generations. A 1,372 English contract for the marriage of Elizabeth de Clare and Lionel of Antwerp, for instance, specified not only the size of her dowry, but also detailed arrangements for landholdings, household management, and financial compensation in the event of annulment or widowhood. Every clause was a strategic decision, binding the bride to obligations that could span decades, with little room for personal choice or deviation. Medieval lawyers and scribes took great care to cover even unlikely contingencies, leaving no ambiguity for future disputes. Brides were effectively entering into a legal arrangement that dictated nearly every aspect of their lives. Chroniclers note contracts requiring obedience to the husband under all circumstances, the maintenance of specific household standards, and even detailed instructions on childbearing and education. In some cases, contracts mandated that the bride bear a minimum number of children or adhere to prescribed practices to ensure fertility. Records from 14th-century Castilian courts show that a failure to produce heirs could result in annulment, fines, or loss of lands and titles. The legal system functioned as a reinforcement of social hierarchy, ensuring that the union upheld dynastic interests above personal happiness, health, or personal freedom. Some contracts went further, specifying punishments if the bride failed to maintain her household according to the husband's or family's expectations, adding another layer of pressure and control. Contracts also extended to property and finances. Women were often allowed only limited control over dowries or personal estates, with husbands or male relatives administering wealth on their behalf. A 1,365 Burgundian contract specifies that the bride's lands would generate income for her husband, though she retained rights to jewels and clothing. Any attempt to manage property independently was strictly forbidden and could be legally challenged. This legal framework meant that the bride's social and economic identity was inseparable from her marital obligations, making autonomy almost impossible. Estates were carefully enumerated, with scribes recording boundaries, rents, and tenant obligations to prevent disputes. In some cases, even the bride's personal servants were included in the contract to ensure loyalty and obedience, reflecting the total control families exerted over these unions. Behavioral clauses were surprisingly detailed and strict. Contracts frequently outlined expectations for dress, social conduct, and interactions with court officials. Failure to comply could lead to social disgrace or legal repercussions. In one 1,390 French contract, a bride was explicitly forbidden from visiting certain towns without her husband's consent, a restriction designed to limit her social influence and prevent alliances outside the marriage. Such clauses underscored the extensive surveillance under which royal brides lived, with every action legally constrained by agreements negotiated before they could fully understand their implications. The contracts also addressed succession and inheritance, often specifying how titles and lands would pass in the event of death or childlessness. These provisions were not merely bureaucratic. They could determine the balance of power between kingdoms and noble houses. A 1,375 Aragonese marriage contract details joint stewardship of estates and succession rights, ensuring that any offspring would solidify political alliances. In effect, the bride became a legal instrument to guarantee dynastic continuity, with personal desires subordinated entirely to political necessity. Finally, enforcement mechanisms made these obligations more intimidating. Breaches could result in fines, imprisonment, or annulment, with chroniclers documenting multiple cases where brides faced punishment for failing to meet contractually stipulated duties. The sheer detail and scope of these agreements reveal a society where personal agency was secondary to alliance building and legal obligation. Brides were expected to navigate their daily lives with constant awareness that any misstep could have lasting political and financial consequences. Medieval marriage contracts were, in essence, lifelong blueprints dictating the terms of a bride's life. They encompassed wealth, behavior, succession, and social interaction, leaving little room for autonomy. Every word, every clause, was designed to reinforce family status and political power, binding the bride in ways that were both practical and oppressive, ensuring that her role in the marriage served dynastic purposes long before any personal feelings, preferences, or agency were considered. Pregnancy and the fear of infertility. Royal brides in medieval Europe quickly discovered that marriage was inseparable from reproduction. From the moment the marriage was consummated, attention turned to fertility, with every menstrual cycle, missed period, or miscarriage carefully noted by attendants, physicians, and family members. Failure to conceive was not merely a private disappointment. It could trigger political instability, public shame, and even the annulment of a union. Chronicles from the French court in 1385 report that Queen Isabeau of Bavaria's early difficulties in conceiving prompted her father-in-law, Charles VI, to summon physicians daily, who recorded her symptoms in excruciating detail, from appetite changes to pulse, with each observation forming part of a dossier that could determine her future as queen. Even minor signs of fatigue or nausea were scrutinized, and private moments of discomfort were transformed into material for official reports. Medical supervision was invasive and often uncomfortable. Royal physicians, who frequently lacked modern understanding of human reproduction, recommended diets, herbal remedies, and sometimes painful physical treatments intended to promote conception. Castilian medical records from 1371 list prescriptions for teas made of pennyroyal, angelica, and saffron, combined with strict regimens of rest and bathing. Some treatments required the bride to endure hot compresses or sit in heated rooms for hours, while others involved bloodletting or purging to balance humors. Failure to follow these instructions, whether due to illness or personal discomfort, could be interpreted as negligence, potentially resulting in blame directed at the bride for political ramifications. In some cases, physicians monitored the bride at all hours, observing sleep patterns and physical exertion, leaving her little privacy or relief. Pressure extended beyond the medical realm. Attendants were instructed to monitor every action that could affect fertility, from diet to sexual activity, and even clothing choices were sometimes dictated by superstition, with specific colors and fabrics considered more fertility-friendly. Diaries from the English court in 1392 describe a young bride who was forbidden from wearing red for 6 months after marriage, as red was believed to distract the womb or provoke infertility. Social expectation was relentless. The bride's body was treated as a political instrument, and failure to perform its reproductive function could provoke criticism, rumors, or outright hostility from extended family and court officials. Even seemingly trivial behaviors, such as the timing of meals or amount of sleep, were carefully regulated to maximize reproductive potential. Pregnancy itself carried danger. Maternal mortality in the medieval period was high, and royal brides were no exception. Aristocratic women were expected to conceive quickly and repeatedly, often before their bodies had fully matured. Medical accounts such as those of Margaret of Anjou in 1445, describe interventions during miscarriage or difficult labor that were crude by modern standards. Herbal infusions, physical manipulations, and at times, surgical procedures conducted without anesthesia. Each pregnancy was a delicate balance between fulfilling dynastic duty and surviving the inherent risks of medieval childbirth, a balance monitored intensely by both family and court observers. Some brides experienced multiple miscarriages, each one documented with clinical precision, adding to the emotional and political pressure. The stakes of fertility extended to dynastic security. An heir confirmed the continuity of lineage and solidified political alliances, while the absence of children threatened succession and could spark civil disputes. Chroniclers recount that in the case of Blanche of Navarre in 1370, delays in producing an heir caused negotiations for alternative marriages for her husband, illustrating the precarious position of a bride whose reproductive performance determined the stability of kingdoms. Fertility was inseparable from reputation, authority, and the perception of competence. A royal bride's value was judged largely by her capacity to provide heirs. For many brides, the relentless monitoring, medical interventions, and social scrutiny created a constant state of anxiety. Diaries, letters, and court records collectively depict young women burdened with immense expectation, their private health matters treated as public business. Every symptom, delay, or complication was documented meticulously, with both successful pregnancies and failures having lasting consequences for the bride's status, influence, and survival. Fertility was not a personal matter. It was a political mandate, a test of endurance, and an ongoing negotiation between the demands of biology and the imperatives of power. Even moments that might seem personal or intimate today were closely observed, leaving royal brides under near-constant evaluation and pressure. Health risks and the perils of medicine. Royal brides in medieval Europe lived under constant scrutiny, not only for fertility, but also for their general health, and the medical practices of the time often amplified the danger. Medicine was primitive, largely guided by humoral theory and superstition rather than empirical science. Physicians, often men with minimal training beyond copying older texts, prescribed treatments that could be as lethal as the illnesses they sought to cure. Diaries and court records from the 14th and 15th centuries reveal that a royal bride's every ailment, from minor headaches to digestive complaints, was meticulously documented, with attendants observing symptoms, reporting changes, and executing, often bizarre interventions. One of the most common treatments was bloodletting, intended to balance humors, but which frequently left brides weak, dizzy, or fainting. Chroniclers from the English court in 1374 describe Lady Margaret of York enduring a regimen of bloodletting over several weeks, her attendants noting pale skin, trembling hands, and near collapse following each session. Similar accounts from the Burgundian court reveal young brides subjected to repeated purging with herbal concoctions to cleanse the body, often resulting in dehydration or malnutrition. Physicians were convinced that these interventions prevented disease, but the interventions themselves could worsen the bride's condition, highlighting the precariousness of relying on contemporary medical wisdom. Medicinal substances often included exotic and dangerous ingredients. Mummy powder, crushed skull, and powdered minerals, such as arsenic, were used to treat fever, melancholy, or digestive issues. A 1389 French medical ledger lists treatments for a bride experiencing severe abdominal pain that included a mixture of crushed pearls, dried viper flesh, and rosewater. While some herbal remedies had beneficial effects, such as certain antiseptic herbs for wound care, the risk of accidental poisoning or adverse reactions was high. Royal brides, particularly those who were young or frail, were often too powerless to refuse prescribed remedies, making compliance a matter of survival and social expectation rather than choice. Invasive procedures carried additional peril. Surgery, rarely performed with anesthesia, was often a last resort. Court accounts from Italy in the late 14th century describe a bride undergoing a minor procedure to remove a cyst, where attendants had to restrain her to ensure the surgeon could complete the operation. Without sterilization or effective pain relief, even small procedures risked infection, prolonged suffering, or death. Complications during childbirth further illustrate the dangers. Obstetric interventions ranged from crude manipulations to the use of iron hooks or forceps, applied by physicians who believed these actions necessary to ensure the survival of the child or protect dynastic continuity. Even daily health management could be hazardous. Diet was strictly controlled, with physicians prescribing specific foods, fasting regimens, and herbal teas, often ignoring the bride's own appetite or preferences. In some cases, failure to follow dietary instructions could be interpreted as moral or spiritual weakness. Sleep, exercise, and bathing were similarly regulated, reflecting the belief that the body's balance was closely linked to environmental and behavioral discipline. Royal brides had little autonomy in these matters, and the psychological toll of constant observation, combined with the physical effects of treatment, could contribute to lasting health problems. The anxiety surrounding illness extended beyond physical consequences. Young brides often internalized fear of inadequacy, viewing any sickness or discomfort as a failure to meet dynastic expectations. Letters from the court of Charles VI describe brides expressing guilt or distress over minor ailments, worrying that illness would delay childbirth or diminish family prestige. The intersection of health, duty, and politics created a pervasive atmosphere of vulnerability, where personal well-being was inseparable from social and dynastic obligation. Royal brides' experiences with medieval medicine underscore the perilous nature of healthcare at the time. Bloodletting, purging, toxic compounds, and invasive procedures were routine, while diet, exercise, and even rest were strictly controlled. The combination of physical risk, psychological pressure, and social expectation meant that the daily life of a bride was fraught with medical danger, and surviving illness often required compliance, endurance, and sheer luck. Every fever, headache, or complication could have profound implications, making the practice of medicine as much a source of stress as a potential remedy. Social surveillance and court intrigue. Royal brides in medieval Europe quickly learned that entering a court meant surrendering nearly all privacy. Life in a royal household was under constant observation, and every gesture, conversation, or expression was noted, analyzed, and reported. Attendants, ladies-in-waiting, and senior officials functioned as a web of surveillance, ensuring that the bride conformed to expectations of behavior, dress, and etiquette. Letters and diaries from the 14th century repeatedly note that minor lapses, such as a delayed curtsy, a poorly chosen word, or an incorrectly placed hand, could be interpreted as disrespect, incompetence, or even a political statement. Royal brides were, in effect, living under continuous scrutiny, their actions both social performance and political signal, with few moments of genuine privacy or respite. Court intrigue was inseparable from this surveillance. Rival factions within the court watched for any sign of weakness or opportunity, ready to exploit the bride's inexperience. Chronicles from 1378 detail the experience of Joanna of Castile, whose attendants reported every conversation she had with influential courtiers to her mother-in-law, in an attempt to preempt alliances that might undermine her position. Gossip was currency, and misinformation could be as dangerous as an armed coup. The bride's reputation, carefully managed by her family before marriage, could unravel quickly if she misstepped socially or failed to navigate complex interpersonal hierarchies. Political marriages magnified these stakes, since the bride's behavior could influence diplomacy, inheritance disputes, and alliances between kingdoms. The networks of observation extended into all aspects of daily life. Dining, attending mass, or even walking through palace corridors involved careful attention to posture, speech, and interaction. A 1385 English court account notes that a young bride's laughter during a formal dinner was criticized as improper levity, prompting her mother-in-law to instruct attendants to monitor her conduct more closely. Even private correspondence could be intercepted or read by others, with letters scrutinized for tone, content, and political implication. Royal brides had little opportunity to form friendships outside approved circles, and trust was exceptionally rare. Even mundane moments, like visiting the garden or moving between chambers, could be observed and reported as evidence of character or loyalty. Household staff often functioned as both caretakers and informants. Diaries from the Burgundian court describe attendants submitting daily reports on the bride's demeanor, health, and emotional state, noting moments of anger, sadness, or fatigue. Any expression deemed socially inappropriate could be relayed to senior officials or family members, with repercussions ranging from reprimand to restrictions on personal freedoms. In some cases, attendants were deliberately placed to monitor specific interactions, creating a psychological environment where the bride could never be certain that she was unobserved. This constant monitoring meant that even private conversations between the bride and her own family were potentially reported, limiting any opportunity for candid discussion. Intrigue also influenced alliances and power dynamics. Court factions frequently competed for influence over the bride, seeking to align her decisions with their political objectives. Records from the 1390s illustrate how advisors and relatives manipulated small favors, invitations, and household appointments to secure loyalty or marginalize rivals. Even minor errors, such as misallocating gifts, mispronouncing names, or failing to follow ceremonial protocol, could be interpreted as political maneuvering, potentially altering perceptions of competence or loyalty. Royal brides were also expected to manage their own networks carefully, balancing loyalty to family, husband, and court factions. Failure to navigate these relationships could isolate a bride or provoke political retaliation. Letters from Isabella of Valois in 1400 describe the careful attention required to maintain favor with multiple parties simultaneously, from her husband's advisors to visiting dignitaries. The constant requirement to observe, interpret, and respond to social cues created a life of relentless strategic calculation, leaving little room for personal expression or leisure. Surveillance and intrigue created a daily environment of tension and vigilance. For a young bride, the palace was simultaneously home, stage, and battlefield, where every smile, glance, and action could carry political weight. The ever-present observation, combined with the maneuvering of rival factions, reinforced that the personal autonomy of royal brides was minimal. Social missteps could ripple outward, affecting family reputation, political alliances, and even survival, ensuring that life at court was an unending exercise in caution, calculation, and compliance, leaving the bride constantly aware that any moment of perceived weakness could have immediate and lasting consequences for her position and safety. Religious pressures and moral expectations. Royal brides in medieval Europe were expected to exemplify piety, morality, and religious devotion, often under intense scrutiny. Religion was not a private matter, but a political instrument, with spiritual observance reinforcing dynastic legitimacy and family honor. From the moment a bride entered a royal household, she was subjected to rigid schedules of prayer, mass attendance, and devotional rituals. Chroniclers from the French court in 1382 note that Queen Marguerite of Flanders was required to rise at dawn for matins, attend multiple daily masses, and participate in long periods of silent reflection, with attendants recording her compliance in meticulous detail. Failure to adhere to religious duties could provoke censure, diminish her perceived virtue, and even affect political alliances, often leaving the bride anxious and hyper-aware of her every move. Moral expectations were equally rigorous. Brides were instructed in modesty, humility, and obedience, with particular attention paid to interactions with men and behavior in public spaces. Court manuals from 1390 outline detailed protocols for sitting, speaking, and even glancing, ensuring the bride maintained an image of decorum that reflected both her family and her husband's house. Deviations from expected moral behavior, such as laughter considered inappropriate, gestures interpreted as flirtatious, or unsanctioned social interactions, could provoke scandal. These rules were enforced by senior attendants and family members, creating a constant atmosphere of surveillance, where personal judgment was subordinated to social and religious conformity. Even minor lapses could trigger formal reprimands or public embarrassment, as records from the 1370s French court show brides admonished for unguarded conversation during feasts. In some cases, brides were also required to attend moral instruction sessions with clergy, receiving feedback that could dictate how they behaved for months afterward. Fasting, penance, and ritualized confession were routine. Royal brides often followed strict dietary restrictions on specific days, sometimes under the direct supervision of their ladies-in-waiting or confessor. Records from the Burgundian court in 1376 describe a bride who fainted during Lent after several days of limited food intake, with her attendants reprimanded for failing to supervise her adherence properly. Confession was similarly monitored. Daily or weekly sessions could require recounting even minor faults, with reports passed to household authorities to assess moral conduct. Additionally, some brides were instructed to maintain detailed spiritual journals, chronicling prayers, penances, and reflections, effectively turning personal devotion into a documented performance. These practices reinforced the bride's role as a living emblem of spiritual virtue, yet frequently imposed physical strain and psychological stress, leaving little time for personal reflection or rest. Pilgrimages and religious ceremonies added another layer of obligation. Brides were expected to participate in processions, attend church festivals, and occasionally travel for politically significant religious observances. In 1389, Isabella of Castile was instructed to join a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela shortly after marriage, despite ongoing health concerns following childbirth. These journeys were both devotional and symbolic, reinforcing alliances between church and state, while simultaneously placing young brides in exhausting and sometimes dangerous situations, exposed to travel hazards, unpredictable weather, and unfamiliar political landscapes. The physical and emotional toll could be severe, yet absence or failure to participate was rarely tolerated. Religious guidance extended into daily life and personal decisions. Advisors and chaplains offered directives on dress, conversation, and even sleep arrangements, often framing obedience as a moral or spiritual imperative. A 1395 English court diary records a confessor instructing a young queen to maintain strict separation from her female attendants at night, citing spiritual purity, while also enforcing proper posture and modest behavior during communal prayers. Compliance was expected to be absolute, and deviation could be interpreted as both spiritual failing and political negligence. The combination of religious and moral oversight shaped every aspect of a bride's life, leaving minimal space for personal reflection or independence. Spiritual observance, diet, confession, ritualized behavior, and pilgrimages became a continuous performance, a daily exercise in discipline and conformity. Royal brides navigated an environment in which their moral and religious behavior was constantly evaluated, their reputation closely tied to perceived spiritual virtue. For many, these expectations were as oppressive as political obligations, intertwining personal belief with dynastic strategy in a manner that left little room for autonomy, self-expression, or decision-making, with consequences for failure extending far beyond the individual to affect family and kingdom alike. Fashion as confinement. Royal brides in medieval Europe quickly realized that fashion was far from mere decoration. It was a form of control, a visible measure of status, and often a source of pain. Gowns were constructed from heavy silks, velvets, and brocades, frequently lined with layers of petticoats, stiffened bodices, and elaborate embroidery. Inventories from a 1,378 Burgundian wedding record gowns weighing upwards of 20 pounds, with gold-threaded hems and pearl embellishments. These garments were designed to impress spectators and signal dynastic wealth, but the weight and rigidity often restricted movement, making even simple tasks, like walking down palace corridors, a strenuous endeavor. Brides were expected to carry themselves with perfect posture despite the discomfort, and attendants remained nearby to correct the slightest misalignment or tug on an errant hem, ensuring that nothing compromised the visual perfection of the ensemble. Corsetry and understructures amplified the difficulty. Bodices were tightly laced to create the desired silhouette, sometimes constricting breathing and causing bruising or fainting. Chroniclers from the English court in 1391 recount young brides being reprimanded for slumping or leaning, even when exhaustion from ceremonial duties made it nearly impossible to maintain proper posture. Attendants were tasked with adjusting garments constantly, ensuring that every fold, seam, and train remained immaculate. The physical toll of fashion was compounded by social expectation. A bride's appearance was a reflection of her family, and any lapse could provoke criticism or insult. Even the smallest misstep, like a slightly wrinkled sleeve or crooked neckline, could result in whispers among courtiers and family members, amplifying anxiety for the bride. Accessories were equally demanding. Veils, tiaras, and jewelry signaled virginity, status, or dynastic ties, but often added additional weight or complicated movement. A 1,365 Castilian court record details a bride whose ornate jeweled headpiece caused her to tilt forward while walking, drawing sharp rebukes from her mother-in-law. Footwear, often pointed or rigid, added further difficulty, creating discomfort and occasional injury. Even gloves, fans, and ceremonial scepters required coordination, creating an almost constant burden of attention and physical effort. Brides frequently reported bruised feet, blistered hands, or neck strain from heavy adornments, yet complaints were socially forbidden, leaving physical suffering silent and invisible to most observers. Seasonal and climate factors worsened the strain. Brides were expected to wear heavy layers even in summer heat or travel long distances in cumbersome attire. In 1382, a French court diary notes that a young bride fainted during a procession in midsummer because of the combination of sun, heavy fabrics, and tight lacing. Medieval courtiers often interpreted fainting as a failure of discipline rather than a natural physical reaction, reinforcing the expectation that suffering should be endured silently and without complaint. Travel by carriage or horseback posed additional hazards, as gowns could snag, become wet or muddy, and complicate mounting or dismounting, requiring constant vigilance. Fashion also enforced social hierarchy. Only certain fabrics, colors, and embellishments were permitted based on rank and family alliances. Court etiquette dictated which materials signaled appropriate status and which were considered presumptuous. A bride wearing a hue or pattern reserved for royalty could provoke scandal or resentment among spectators and relatives. Gowns were therefore both a tool of display and a constraint, forcing adherence to symbolic codes that could carry political implications. Ceremonial attire extended beyond the wedding day. Daily court life demanded adherence to fashionable standards, including seasonal adjustments and ceremonial occasions. Court chronicles show that even informal appearances were scrutinized, and minor deviations could result in subtle social penalties or gossip. Attendants constantly reminded brides of the symbolic and practical importance of maintaining flawless appearance, creating an environment where personal comfort was routinely sacrificed for protocol. In essence, medieval fashion was both spectacle and confinement. Heavy garments, restrictive corsetry, elaborate accessories, and rigid codes of dress transformed royal brides into visible symbols of status and obedience. Physical discomfort, social expectation, and political implication were intertwined, leaving little room for autonomy or choice. Fashion dictated movement, posture, and presentation, turning every appearance into an act of performance where beauty, endurance, and conformity were inseparable, illustrating that even the most decorative aspects of a bride's life were instruments of control, shaping both behavior and perception within the rigid structures of court life. Navigating power and household authority. Royal brides in medieval Europe often discovered that marriage brought responsibilities far beyond producing heirs or maintaining appearances. Within the household, they were expected to oversee a complex network of servants, manage daily operations, and arbitrate disputes, all while remaining under constant observation from senior relatives and advisors. Household authority was a delicate balance. Brides exercised influence, but any perceived overreach could trigger censure or undermine their position. Diaries from the Burgundian court in 1384 note that a young duchess mediated conflicts between kitchen staff and chambermaids, carefully documenting each resolution to demonstrate competence and maintain favor with her husband and his council. In some cases, these household duties extended to supervising the education of younger relatives, ensuring that pages, squires, or wards were properly instructed in etiquette, literacy, and martial preparation, further emphasizing the bride's role as both manager and moral exemplar. Brides were expected to know the hierarchy of the household, understanding not just the roles of servants, but the nuances of their influence. Senior attendants wielded considerable informal power, capable of shaping perceptions of the bride's authority. Records from the French court in 1390 describe a bride subtly managing the distribution of duties among ladies-in-waiting, strategically rewarding loyalty while discouraging dissent. Such actions required acute political awareness. Missteps could be interpreted as incompetence or favoritism, potentially destabilizing alliances within the household or wider court. In addition, the bride had to navigate relationships with external visitors, including merchants, diplomats, and clergy, whose presence required delicate negotiation to maintain both hospitality and political protocol. Estate management was another significant responsibility. Royal households controlled extensive lands, finances, and production resources, and brides were often involved in supervising these operations. In 1375, Isabella of Portugal, newly married to King Richard II's cousin, oversaw agricultural production and coordinated with stewards to ensure food supplies met household and ceremonial needs. Contracts and correspondence show that the bride's instructions were scrutinized by male advisors, illustrating the tension between practical authority and political limitations. Even when empowered to make decisions, her autonomy was circumscribed by expectations of obedience to her husband's directives and adherence to family interests. In some instances, brides personally inspected estates or farms, walking through fields, negotiating with tenants, or reviewing accounts, emphasizing the physical as well as administrative demands of their role. Power in the household extended into ceremonial and social management. Brides coordinated schedules for meals, audiences, and courtly events, often mediating between influential courtiers and visiting dignitaries. Records from 1389 document a bride who meticulously organized seating at a banquet, balancing precedence between allies and rivals to avoid offense. Every choice carried political significance. A misplaced gesture could weaken alliances or diminish family prestige. Such responsibilities demanded vigilance, as the consequences of minor errors could ripple outward to affect broader dynastic negotiations. In addition, they supervised the training and presentation of younger attendants, ensuring that all members of the household upheld appearance, etiquette, and decorum appropriate to their social rank. Additionally, brides sometimes wielded subtle influence over court politics. While overt power was limited, they could act as intermediaries, advocates, or confidants. Correspondence from the Aragonese court in 1377 shows a bride discreetly advising her husband on appointments, leveraging her understanding of household loyalties to shape decisions without appearing to overstep. Influence required careful calculation. Demonstrating competence without provoking resentment or suspicion was a constant challenge, highlighting the complex interplay of authority, gender, and social hierarchy. Even leisure and personal interactions were mediated by household management. Brides could not simply relax or retreat from responsibility. Supervising staff, entertaining guests, and maintaining social harmony were ongoing obligations. The household functioned as both a microcosm of court politics and a proving ground for leadership skills, where effectiveness and decorum determined reputation. They were expected to attend ceremonies, festivals, and courtly entertainments, often acting as visible symbols of authority, while simultaneously maintaining a careful balance between courtesy and control. Navigating power within the household demanded constant attention, political acuity, and careful negotiation. Royal brides exercised influence and authority. Yet every action was constrained by societal expectations, familial oversight, and the intricate dynamics of court life. Mastery of household management was simultaneously an assertion of competence and a performance under relentless scrutiny, leaving little space for personal freedom and ensuring that authority always existed within prescribed boundaries, both visible and invisible to those observing from within the court and beyond. The constant threat of violence and betrayal. Royal brides in medieval Europe lived under a persistent shadow of danger, where political alliances, family rivalries, and domestic tensions created a constant threat of violence and betrayal. Marriages were strategic arrangements, and the stakes were high. A single misstep could provoke attack, abduction, or assassination. Chroniclers from the French court in 1388 recount an attempted kidnapping of Queen Marie of Brabant by rival nobles seeking to manipulate succession, illustrating how even a bride's personal safety was entwined with broader political machinations. Protective measures were elaborate, but never absolute. Castles, guards, and attendants provided a veneer of security while conspiracies and treachery simmered beneath the surface. Royal brides understood that their position made them targets, not just for enemies of the crown but for ambitious courtiers and distant relatives. And every public appearance carried risk, from formal ceremonies to private audiences. Threats came from multiple directions. Some were overt, such as armed raids on palaces or planned attacks during travel. Records from the Castilian court in 1372 detail an incident where a bride's procession was intercepted by mercenaries loyal to a rival faction, requiring immediate intervention by the king's forces. Other threats were subtler, taking the form of poisoning, manipulation, or forced isolation designed to undermine the bride's influence. In 1385, Isabella of Valois reportedly endured attempts by jealous courtiers to frame her for impropriety, demonstrating that betrayal often occurred behind closed doors and through carefully orchestrated deception. Trust was scarce, and every interaction carried potential danger, forcing brides to exercise constant vigilance. Even small social interactions or casual remarks could be twisted into political leverage, requiring brides to consider the implications of every word spoken. Domestic risk was equally real. Husbands, relatives, or advisors sometimes inflicted violence as a means of control, ensuring obedience or punishing perceived failures. Diaries from the Burgundian court in 1391 recount a young duchess who was subjected to physical reprimand after questioning her husband's instructions regarding household management. These acts were rarely publicly condemned, reflecting the acceptance of authority and hierarchy as justification for coercion. For many brides, domestic threats were inseparable from the broader political landscape, as family honor, alliances, and dynastic continuity justified extremes of discipline or intimidation. In some households, even attendants could act as enforcers of these hierarchies, reporting misbehavior or provoking confrontations to assert control. Even ordinary routines carried peril. Travel between estates or during ceremonial events exposed brides to ambush or harassment. Escorts were meticulously arranged, yet historians note that the unpredictability of weather, roads, and human hostility created constant vulnerability. In 1376, a young queen traveling to her husband's court faced multiple attacks by brigands, highlighting how mobility, visibility, and political prominence amplified risk. Security was never absolute, and awareness of potential betrayal infiltrated every journey, every meeting, and every seemingly mundane interaction. Brides quickly learned to evaluate risks in both public and private settings, knowing that any lapse could have long-lasting consequences. The psychological toll of this environment was profound. Royal brides internalized vigilance as part of daily life, observing courtiers, allies, and family members with suspicion. Letters from the English court in 1390 describe a bride who kept detailed records of her attendants' conversations and movements, essentially constructing a network of intelligence to anticipate threats. Fear, mistrust, and the need for constant alertness became ingrained, shaping behavior, interactions, and decision-making. Mental strain was compounded by the knowledge that personal loyalty could not be assumed, and misjudging an ally could jeopardize both safety and political standing. Political marriages intertwined personal vulnerability with dynastic strategy, meaning that survival, reputation, and influence were inseparable. Royal brides existed in a world where betrayal could come from any direction, and violence was always a looming possibility. Life required a combination of caution, strategic thinking, and endurance, as every miscalculation could carry lethal consequences. For these women, being a bride was not merely a ceremonial role. It was a position fraught with danger, where the lines between domestic duty, political obligation, and personal survival were continually tested, and the stakes extended far beyond the private sphere of marriage. Their vigilance had to be constant, extending to every movement, conversation, and decision, knowing that a single misstep could change their fate entirely.